Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Well, without any further ado, as I've heard some people say, let's bring on Jim Russell, James W. Russell, author, professor, XTS activist, a wonderful guy, and it's glad to have him back on the show. It's been almost 2 years to the day. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Mike. Happy to be here.
Good to have you again. Well, why don't you tell us, one of the reasons that I asked you to come on is because you had written on an STS email list, that's Students for Democratic Society for all you young ones, about our friend Robert Pardun, who was an organizer, activist, author, came out of University of Texas SDS. I always looked up to him, part of the kind of prairie power, mixing politics and culture. You were close to that too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Robert Pardun?
Well, I first met Robert Pardun when SDS sponsored a conference of miners in Hazard, Kentucky. And I had hitchhiked there from Oklahoma, where I had been involved in organizing a chapter of SDS. And that's when I met the contingent from Texas, which included Robert. And we then, they offered me a ride back from that conference all the way to northern Texas, which sure beat hitchhiking back. So I piled into a car with a whole bunch of people, and we talked all the way, riding through the Deep South. One of the people in the car was Black, so it was a mixed group, and you can imagine in those days what that was like. Anyway, Robert was about to get a job as an SDS campus traveler. That meant he went from campus to campus, either places where there were chapters already to kind of tie things together. Remember, this is all pre-internet, and telephone calls are very expensive, so there was a lot of face-to-face contact in those days. And that's was kind of Robert's job. And then he would try to organize chapters along the way. So he showed up in Norman, Oklahoma, where I was. And we spent a few days together. And he had such a contagious personality, which was one of the reasons why a number of people said he was one of the best organizers that SDS ever had. He was a really nice guy. He was very unassuming. You felt like you were his best friend in a way, and I'm sure he had a lot of people who felt that way. So he did that for a long time. Then he moved up to the SDS national office, which was in Chicago, and at various times worked out of that office in terms of national leadership. Now, the tragedy of Robert's life is that he inherited Parkinson's disease from his mother. And, I think it probably came on when he was in his 50s or 60s. Yeah. And then I kept in touch with him off and on over the decades after the 1960s. And then he had adult children in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm.
Let me jump in here. You mentioned that conference in Hazard, Kentucky. Was that in '64?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember getting a notice about that. I had been involved in sort of the takeover of the college newspaper at Lake Forest College, and we got the college press service. And there was a story about these unemployed miners, the Northern Student Movement, Students for Democratic Society, and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, meeting in Hazard. And that just fanned the flame, so to speak, of my love for the notion of the interracial movement of the poor and just people, all different kind of people getting together. And probably one of my favorite memories of Pardun is when I traded him a deer skin that I had gotten at a trading post at Canyon de Chelly for a cowboy shirt that he had with nice snaps on it. He was a wonderful guy, and I'm glad that you wrote an obit about him in the SDS newsletter. And I just wanted to share a little bit with the masses who are listening to or viewing our show about this wonderful guy who has passed. There's a lot of us who are going out. We're moving along. So you have a number of books out, and I want to get to that. But first, I want to get your comments, because I know you're paying a little bit of attention to what's going on with the U.S. government and Venezuela.
Yeah. I mean, to say something that, maybe people haven't heard so much is the way that it's covered in the United States right now is you would get a sense that the Chavista movement has totally collapsed, and that that Trump has basically been able to take over the oil supply, and that the acting president of the country, Delcy Rodriguez, has pretty much abandoned any of the types of things that the movement in Venezuela wanted. Okay, well, I think that that's a very distorted view of it. If you look at the scene on the ground in Caracas and other cities in Venezuela, all kinds of people turned out in the hundreds of thousands to support that government after the abduction of the president Maduro, which is just such an outrageous thing to have happened. And so that what is I think a better interpretation of what's going on is that the leadership of the PSUV, which is the Socialist Party of Venezuela, the leadership of that has had to retreat, and it's a strategic retreat, which is very different than abandoning, what the project is, and so, they're negotiating, and Delcy Rodriguez is a very, very capable person. She went to the Sorbonne, she went to Oxford, she speaks several languages. She's been with the Chavistas since the beginning of that, was close to, the leadership, and then worked her way into that leadership, and, was very, very close to Hugo Chavez. So what's going on is a very strategic, what I think anyway. I don't have any special, contact with that, but what my interpretation from a distance and having followed it for a number of years is that the leadership is strategically trying to maneuver around this incredible attack and bombardment. It's the first time that a South American country has ever been bombarded like that, from the air, and over 100 people were killed, and it's just a horrible thing that happened.
Euan, you had a question for Jim.
Yeah, Jim. Mike's told me a lot about you, and I'm kind of interested in those connections between the civil rights movement and SDS and activism in the 1960s. And I noticed that you mentioned 1964. You were involved in also some sit-ins in Oklahoma. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on that, and in Martin Luther King week, how the civil rights gains are being rolled back in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, well, I was involved in a part of this civil rights movement that was really not at the center of it. It was in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a border South state, and it was in Tulsa. Okay, now Tulsa, since 1964, there's been a lot of national news about the 1921 massacre in Tulsa. Okay, when I grew up in Tulsa, that was never mentioned. Okay,
that was a massacre of a black community that was like the Black Wall Street.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was Greenwood, North Tulsa, okay, a very vibrant community, okay, and then there was an incident that got blown totally out of proportion, and then a bunch of whites attacked Greenwood, okay, and the death toll remains unknown, but at least 300 people were killed in that. And some people call it the largest race massacre in American history. Okay, well, in 1964, there were sit-ins. Okay, and you have to remember that between 1921 and 1964 is only 40 years. Okay, it's 43 years. So there were a lot of people alive in 1964 who had lived through that. And it was especially true in the Black community, which had been historically traumatized by that. So the Black community was somewhat conservative and was not everybody was in favor of the sit-ins that occurred. I'm just sort of painting the context of that, and so sit-ins were held. And I make the argument that the first sit-ins in the modern history of the civil rights movement occurred in Oklahoma, okay, in Oklahoma City. In 1958, Clara Luper, a leader of the NAACP in Oklahoma City, led lunch counter sit-ins. Okay, that was well before the ones in North Carolina, which a lot of people put as the beginning of the sit-in movement. But this happened in Oklahoma City. And then in 1964, she came up from Oklahoma City, encouraged people to sit in, brought a bunch of young people with her, joined the first sit-ins. Okay, and I submit that they were the last sit-ins in the movement, because soon after that, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, which integrated. Now, I'm being a little bit kind of bragging about Oklahoma here, and it's sort of claim to fame that hardly anybody recognizes or knows, but I think it's a detail that's an interesting one. Yeah, so I took part in that, and then took part in another school integration after that. I ended up being a restaurateur at the Heartland Cafe where the show originated. And long before I opened the Heartland, I used to talk, when I was young, I'd talk about having a truck stop in Oklahoma. Why? I don't know. I thought Oklahoma was cool. I don't like it as much these days, the current government. But it is home of a lot of socialists back in the day. And, there was the Green Corn Rebellion in Oklahoma, where black, white, Indian, Mexican farmers didn't want to go serve in the First World War. Let's move to your books a little bit. And I do want you to talk about, one of your books talks about, or one of the topics you've suggested is
Medicare versus Medicare Advantage, which I do have Medicare Advantage. I keep thinking I just want to go back to regular Medicare. Fill us in on that. But before that, I'm just going to say, because we're not going to have time to talk about it, people should know that you wrote a great novel. You have about 11 books out, pretty serious stuff. But you wrote a novel called Escape from Texas, a novel of slavery and the Texas War of Independence. I just want to recommend it to everyone. It really gripped me and was a very powerful book. But tell us a little bit about Medicare versus Medicare Advantage, because you have become an expert on retirement.
Okay. Well, yeah. Medicare, of course, is a big part of retirement. Okay, because until the 1960s, if you retired, okay, you probably didn't have any health insurance at all. Okay, and then Medicare, passed under Johnson. Okay, and so now we have this program, which is it makes it in a very interesting way that when you look at the statistics, okay, that comparing the United States and Europe, okay, of course, Europeans all have health care; it's universal. Okay, and then their health outcomes are a lot better. But there's one group in the United States that's actually competitive with Europe, and that is people who are over 65 because they have Medicare. Okay, and so if you compare apples to apples here, people over 65 in Europe and people over 65 in the United States. The United States doesn't look so bad, okay, because we have this great government-sponsored program. Okay. Well, of course, we have people who want to privatize that program, and the name of that privatization is Medicare Advantage, where the government pays private insurance companies to administer the program. Okay, now, a lot of people might think, well, so who cares, who administers it, the federal government or a private insurance company, and aren't private insurance companies very efficient? Well, there are two very big reasons why you should care. Okay, the first reason is that if you have traditional Medicare, that's the government program, you can see up to 98% of all doctors and hospitals in the country take traditional Medicare. Okay, and so you essentially have universal coverage wherever you go. Okay, you live in Chicago, you happen to go to that truck stop in Oklahoma, you run into a problem, okay, you just go to the nearest facility and they'll take Medicare. That's not true of Medicare Advantage. Medicare Advantage has networks, okay, and you have to see somebody in one of those networks. Now, this can be a problem, and I'll tell you the problem. Okay, try not to bring you down a little bit, but I have cancer. Okay, so I have a rare form of cancer, and I need to see certain specialists. I can't just see any oncologist. Okay, there has to be people who have real experience with what I have. And when I found out who that specialist was in Portland. And when I went to her, she said she was sorry, but she didn't take my insurance because I had Medicare Advantage at the time. Okay, so I was in a real jam, okay, with a very serious illness. And that can happen to anyone. Okay, that is, your Medicare Advantage plan may work fine until you suddenly run into a very unusual problem. Okay, and then you find out that you can't go to the person that you need to go to. So that's, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I have a setup where I can really see any doctor. And I guess my real question, though, is can one switch from, and would it be advisable, from Medicare Advantage back to Medicare?
Okay, well, first I'm going to challenge whether you really can see any doctor, because my plan supposedly had that feature. Okay, but it turns out that you can see any doctor as long as that doctor is willing to see you. And with Medicare Advantage plans, the doctors and the hospitals are free to not take it. For example, I have my plan actually through the state of Connecticut, because I used to work there. Okay, and just recently, the Mayo Clinic stopped taking the plan that the state of Connecticut has. Okay, it's a Medicare Advantage plan. So people who needed to go there, okay, were suddenly in the same type of jam I was in Portland. Now, it's a kind of long story because I'm involved in a movement actually from Oregon in terms of Connecticut it's a union struggle to get it so that we can choose between Medicare and that Medicare Advantage. Now, you asked the question about can you switch back to Medicare? The answer is yes, but here's the problem. Okay, if you have a serious illness, okay, you can switch back to Medicare. That part is fine, but Medicare only pays 80%. And so most people need a supplemental plan, a Medigap plan. Okay, and those are administered by private companies. The private companies can use pre-existing conditions to jack up your price. So were I to go on the market for a Medigap plan having cancer, okay, I would be paying, probably $4,000 or $5,000 a month for a plan, which I would not be able to afford. That was one of the things that when Obamacare was passed, that they never got around to dealing with it, okay, is that Obamacare, kind of dealt with the problem of pre-existing conditions in terms of the exchanges, okay, but it didn't deal with this type of issue in terms of Medicare Advantage. And
we're going to run short of time, so why don't you ask a question? You're ready.
Yeah, we got a couple of minutes left, James, and you talk about some of these things, I guess, in your new book, the medical memoir about recovering from illness. I was just wondering, our next guest is going to talk about the importance of community and community support, and so I'm just wondering what is your lesson that you take away from your writing on your medical situation and illness?
Yeah, I mean, I went through, cancer. I had a lung removed. I ended up having open heart surgery, almost got killed in the process. And I've recovered really well from it. Okay, and so that book is not a particularly political book. It's just it's a memoir about my experience going through it. I would say the one big lesson is that if you're in a situation like that, you try to get the best conventional care you can get. That's absolutely essential, but you don't leave it at that. Okay, there's also a lot of things that you can do on your own, like exercise, diet, good sleep. All of these things can help in terms of recovery. So this book is a lot about what I did that enabled me to, get through something that almost killed me and, was very, very debilitating in terms of the recovery.
Well, we're really glad to have you on today, and you are one of our medical advisors these days. We did recently have Ellen Mason and Mary Driscoll on, who are two longtime activists, et cetera, and in the medical world. And they were talking about the medical situation in the country. So between them and you, we got a lot of good advisors. And I do appreciate your stories from Oklahoma. Okay, Jim, really glad to have you. I know you've been working hard this morning. You had to drive someone to an appointment. We're glad you joined us, and we're all going to take